Have you ever loved and not been loved back? Then perhaps you should read Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. And how bad does unrequited love hurt? Let's find out. Hey guys, welcome to Whiskey and Literature. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. This is my 52nd and final book review of the year, Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. And this is, according to the algorithm, the greatest book of all time. Before we get to the review, let's talk about the author, Marcel Proust. Marcel Proust was a French novelist, essayist, and critic. He was born in 1871, passed away in 1922. I did find it interesting when reading about him that the article said he is considered one of the greatest authors by critics and other writers, not by readers. In Remembrance of Things Past, or as it's known now, In Search of Lost Time, is certainly his greatest work. His own youth and the changes that happened around him are central to all of his works. On to the specs and stats of In Search of Lost Time, or just Swann's Way. Is this 7 books in a series, or is it 7 parts to one book? I can't really answer that question. I've only read Swann's Way. Proust began this work in 1909, and he continued to write and revise the work until he passed away. It was initially published between 1913 and 1927. Swann's Way was the first part, and it was originally published in 1913, and initially it was rejected by quite a few publishers, much to their chagrin. I paid $13.99 for this Lydia Davis translation from Amazon, and I do really like this printing. I think it's probably one of the best looking books that I purchased for my reading in 2023. I did listen to a portion of this on Audible. It was a different translation because I couldn't find the Lydia Davis translation on Audible. And I do have a slight beef with Audible because of the numerous Swann's Way translations that they had available. On at least several of them, they had no translator listed. And as I've been reading these classics this year, the idea of translators, it has become important to me. And I don't see why you would have a book like this on Audible without the translator listed. Get a clue, Audible. The version that I did listen to, that was the Scott Moncrief translation, and this was read by the great George Goodall, which is why I picked that translation, for 21 hours and 27 minutes. A brief word about the style of Swann's Way. I think the overarching theme of this work is experience. Childhood experiences, love, confusion, disappointment. Experiencing love, falling into and out of, jealousy, social classes, appreciation for the arts, desire, and indifference. The main narrator throughout this work is unnamed in the section Swann's Way, which does take up the bulk of this work. You almost forget that there is a narrator. It's more like an omniscient style narration, and except that occasionally the narrator does interject, especially when Swann comes across his father in these kind of situations. But you almost forget in that section that there's a narrator. We have several main characters in the book. Going back to the unnamed narrator, he's the main mover. We see things through his eyes, except again in the Swann in Love, that we don't really see through his eyes because there's no way he could have been a part of all these things that happens, but apparently he is narrating these things to us. Swann, Charles Swann, he is obviously a big part. He appears in all 3 sections. The middle part is essentially all about him and his love, Odette. And I'm going to butcher a couple of the names in this work because they're French. And so in the last part, again, we have the main narrator, and he meets a girl, and it's at this park, and I believe it's in front of the Eiffel Tower, and it's spelled Gilbert with an E at the end. So how do you pronounce that in French? I don't know. Gilberte? I don't know. It's really an unattractive girl's name as far as I'm concerned. I don't know of any English equivalent to that name. Okay, moving on to a brief description of the plot or what there is of it, of Swann's Way. The main narrator is thinking about the only childhood memory that he really has in his older age. And then one day he eats a Madeleine cake with some tea, and that sparks a memory that he had of eating cake and tea with Francois, the servant in his house when he was growing up. This sparked a whole flood of memories, which is the first part of the story. And we're talking about basic stuff. He's not going into a wardrobe in the closet and going to Narnia. It's just everyday happenings in his life. Having cake and tea with his aunt. He spends a lot of time recalling memories of their servant, Francois. My favorite is his memory of the lady in pink that he met at his uncle's house. And he talked a lot about the visitors at his parents' house and how that interrupted his time with his mom, especially one of his visitors, Mr. Swann. The main bulk of this book is the section Swann in Love. And this has been printed as a standalone story, and I think it does stand outside of and apart from the main narrative. The main character, Swann, he frequents the house most nights for a select group of friends that she domineers over with an iron fist. This group of people are a bit lowbrow and crass for Swann. They like theater, music, art, but they don't have the understanding or the intelligence to appreciate it the way that Swann does. They also don't run in the same lofty circles that he does. Initially, he meets Odette, a one-time, possibly still active, courtesan, who initially he disregards as not very intelligent. He eventually gives in to her physical charms and coquettishness while acknowledging that she is his intellectual inferior. They fall into and out of love. In the last part, we kick back to the main narrator and we get to experience puppy love as he falls into a one-sided relationship with Swann's daughter, Gilberte. And man, that is a major paraphrase and shortening of the plot of Swann's Way. Okay, on to my thoughts of Swann's Way. Have you read the fantasy series, The Wheel of Time, or seen the Amazon series by the same name? One of the characters, Egwene, is being welcomed into the women's circle by Nynaeve and the other women in her village. She gets to braid her hair as a woman for the first time. They're on the edge of this mountain cliff, it's short, overlooking this mountain stream swollen with runoff. Nynaeve is talking to Egwene and then all of a sudden pushes her into the stream. Initially, Egwene is overwhelmed by the water and she's fighting to the surface, fighting the current, trying to get to the top, and all she is doing is drowning until she gives herself over to the current, surrenders to the current, and floats to the top to safety. This scene is pivotal. It's important to the overall story of The Wheel of Time, but that's not the point why I related it here. This is my 52nd read of the year. A lot of these are classics that are like Swann's Way in a lot of respects. If you try and wrestle with these stories, you are quickly overwhelmed and left gasping for breath. Surrender to the power of the prose. Once you acknowledge that you're not going to go in a linear format and that the plot is not the point, then you can surrender and appreciate the work. I did like the story in the first section of, I'm going to call it The Pink Lady. I liked it because I can relate. We've all been in a situation as a child where you're being presented by an intimate of yours, your parent or your uncle in this situation, to another adult who is a stranger to you, who is gushing all over you. And if you're a guy, like I'm a guy, and the narrator is a guy, and you're being introduced to an attractive lady who perhaps refers to you as a lady killer, and maybe you are kind of attracted to her and you don't even know what's going on, it can be fairly awkward. It's very relatable. And I really enjoyed that whole sequence in the first part. One of the central themes is social class. In the part Swann in Love, Swann becomes enamored of Odette. She is socially lower than him and apparently less intellectual or even less intelligent. It seems self-evident that in today's world, mixing of classes, etc., it's commonplace. But it does beg the question, do marriages that have a great disparity in intelligence, if that's the right word, knowledge perhaps, or even curiosity, does that affect the long-term stability of these types of relationships? Can this disparity be overcome? I really enjoyed the aspect of that entire story, the slow burn as the relationship builds and then disintegrates and dies with a whimper. The idea that we can be moved by a phrase of a song or a piece of music, we can be elevated in those around us, and that could be the spark of love between two people. I think that is a great concept. Music, it can be powerful and uplifting. And it turns out it was that same phrase, that same turn of music that towards the end of that portion of the story that woke Swann up, really let him face the music of the failure of his relationship. Swann's romance with Odette seemed to me the opposite of that in Pride and Prejudice. There, Mr. Darcy considered Elizabeth plain, but was won over by her wit and intelligence. Swann initially considered Odette less intelligent, but was won over by her looks and her coquettishness. I do think overall the Pride and Prejudice model would work out better. The narrator's puppy love in the last part is in similitude of Swann's love for Odette at the end of that part. Gilberte really liked him as a friend. His love and attraction for her was not reciprocated. She wasn't even aware that it existed. And obviously, we have all been there. It is very relatable. Super easy to sympathize with that section. Okay, a couple gripes. Like, what's with it with these novels with no breaks? We have 440 pages in this book with 3 parts. No chapter breaks. It's laborious reading thus. It's so dumb. I'm not, to be honest with you, really sure how much I enjoy this writing style. I think underlying there is a great story to tell, but you have to wade through these waters of mucky muck to get to the meat of it. I'm no good really at surrendering to a story. I prefer my stories to go from A to B. I don't even mind if you go from A to C and then back to B, but this one's just all over the place. This style of meandering musings between movements is mind-numbing. You know what? Perhaps the best way to experience Swann's Way is not to read it, listen to it. Put your earbuds in, get a tall glass of whiskey, and let the great George Goodall tell you a tale. I am overall glad to have read Swann's Way. I don't intend to return to Marcel Proust or In Search of Lost Time. And according to the algorithm, this is the greatest book of all time. Does it deserve to be on the list? Yes. Is it number 1? To me, I don't think so. My question to you is, have you read Swann's Way? Have you read the entire series? Are you planning on it? What are your thoughts on it if you have? So what it comes down to is, if you like to float on the top, put this on your shelf. All right, my friends, I judge all my books on 5 criteria, 6 if I listen to an Audible, and let's go. Initial response, how do I feel as soon as I finish the book? I gave it a 3. Recommendation, how likely am I to recommend the book? 2. Style, did I enjoy the writing style? 2. Plot structure, how engaged was I in the story? Got a 4. Characters, were they relatable, believable, engaging? 4. And Audible, for those books I listened to a part of at least, how is the production? And I think George Goodall is an awesome narrator, and it gets a 5. All right, that's 20. And 20 divided by 6 is 3.33. So 3.33 stars for Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. And I think that's an adequate score for this read. All right, my friends, if you enjoyed the video, like it, subscribe to see more of my content. The channel is called Whiskey and Literature. I do both book and whiskey reviews. This has been my final review of 2023. And next year, I'm gonna make a video here pretty quick about my schedule for 2024. I'm kind of moving away from the classics and I'm gonna move into some more popular books. These books that I've read this year, this was a curated list by the algorithm of the 50 greatest books of all time. And then we added 2 books, one for my wife and one for my kids, to get the 52 books in 52 weeks. So stick around for those. I'm really excited about my reading schedule next year. I'm going to outline that in the next week or 2. And so stay tuned for that. But now you know what to do, my friends. Turn the pages and stay thirsty. Cheers.